Hello and welcome to Unwrapping Wine. My name is Anne Zwink and my co-host.
Randall Voss.
Hello. Thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to be visiting with Tom Plocher, and he is a grape breeder who has come up with 3 fantastic varieties that we can grow in the upper Midwest, but not only there, all around the world. And in addition to many states, we are going to hear about what he looks for in his grape breeding program and what makes those grapes so wonderful for growing in our regions and what makes the wine.
What I think growers, at least here, really appreciate about Tom's cultivars is late budbreak. Right now we'd had a pretty mild winter, and so we're really concerned about early budbreak on a lot of our cultivars. And so we did a episode about Marquette not too long ago. We love that variety, but it breaks bud early. And one thing that Tom's cultivars are kind of known for is late bud break and also tannins, right? Right, Ann?
Yeah. Love me some tannins in the winery.
So
Please enjoy this episode with Tom Plocher.
So today we have Tom Plocher, and he is a grape breeder from Minnesota. And so maybe if you've heard of Petite Pearl, Crimson Pearl, Verona, and so forth, Tom is the creator of those. And so we're super excited to talk with Tom. I think he's a minor celebrity, or maybe a major celebrity in the cold-hearted grape world. So we're stoked that we get to talk with him. So thanks for joining us, Tom.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Tom. I'm definitely a super fan, so I'm so excited to hear. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and your background and how you got started?
Sure. Aside from the corporate job, I got started with grapes, cold climate grapes, back in about 1980, when there were 2 wineries in Minnesota, Alexis Bailey and a lesser known one called Lake Sylvia Winery up by St. Cloud. And they always kind of disagree about who had the first Minnesota farm winery license, but I think it was probably the one in Lake Sylvia by a couple of days. So that was the state of things. And at that time, people were mostly growing French hybrids and burying them in different ways with chopped up corn stalks, and some people were plowing dirt on the vines. And I mean, it's not surprising. I don't think anyone had more than an acre of grapes because it was so laborious to do that. And no one wanted to do that kind of work. And they still got winter injury even when they buried them. The cold hardy grapes that were available were mostly things like Beta and Swelter, which they're actually they actually made some commercial wines out of Swelter. I guess that was the lesser of the 2 evils.
Are they both? So I know Beta has some quote foxy aromas. I don't know the other one. Does that have foxy aromas too, or
not as much?
Okay.
There's more Riparia aromas,
Okay.
Slightly more acceptable. And then and Edelweiss and Swenson Red were out already. But they're not fully hardy around here, especially Swenson Red isn't, and always has its hardiness problems too. So they weren't really good options. But Elmer kept working all this time through the 60s and 70s, and I think the really big thing that I got to witness firsthand was when he patented St. Croix, St. Pepin, and La Crosse, and introduced wine from those through a winemaker he cooperated with at a Minnesota Grape Growers Association annual meeting, and it was just amazing. No one had ever tasted a wine like the St. Croix was at the time, and we kind of look at it now as being kind of problematic, but compared to what we had and the fact that we didn't have to bury it, that was just astounding. And the same thing with someone brought a lacrosse wine that just was really well made to that same meeting. And so that was, I think, would have been more game changing, except that we only had two wineries, and there was no wine industry then, and so there, I'm sure some of those migrated to Iowa and some to Wisconsin, but there weren't producers to provide a big demand for them. So I think I think that's why, kind of in the history of things, those kind of got lost in the shuffle a little bit. But I got to see that, and I got to meet Elmer Swenson and got to know him pretty well. Yeah, a couple times a year, I would go out to his vineyard in Osceola, Wisconsin, and we would just walk through, and he would show me all the new things he was doing, and kind of talk about his breeding philosophies and what he's using for parents and all this stuff. And I just got intrigued by that, and by the idea of taking the best of his selections and crossing them with the best selections from other lines of breeding, like the U of M, for example, is what I ended up using. And actually, the guy who owned Lake Sylvia Winery way back in the day, David McGregor, was a grape breeder as well, and that was actually his main interest was breeding grapes back in that time, not really operating that winery. So I had three really good lines of breeding, cold hardy grape breeding, and each of those people had really hardy material to start with as hardy parents. So from the U of M, I got Minnesota 1094, which is also a parent of Marquette. Probably back in the late 80s or early 90s. Peter Hempstead gave me some cuttings from that. Dave McGregor had crossed St. Croix with Riparia 89 and had some super hardy selections from that. And I used one of those as the hardy parent in the cross that produced Verona.
Okay.
And then Elmer had numerous hardy things, but I think probably my favorite hardy grapes from Elmer were he had a whole row of these seedlings that was block 10, row 18, and he had, I don't know, 150 seedlings in the row. And some of those were extremely hardy, even though they were half vinifera. And it was such an amazing thing to pull off. And the vinifera parents or grandparents were Chardonnay and Cabernet Sauvignon. So this was a cross he just deliberately did for wine. And most of his crosses were done for dual use or for table grapes, but that was a cross he did specifically for wine. So I have used his 10-18-6, which is a blue grape that's really hardy. And his 10-18-14 is apparent in most of my white wine crosses. That one actually looks a little bit like Chardonnay and tastes a little like Chardonnay, except it has a little bit of the hybrid plastic aroma to it. So anyway, that's how I got interested. I met these people and got to know them well. And then Peter Hempstead came along in 1985, and we still are good friends, and we used to get together and just talk about all these odd grapes from around the world that we had heard of that had different good characteristics potentially for breeding, and eventually he got pollen from some of them and used them, and I did the same, and we would share pollen back and forth. And then I got to know Elmer well. So yeah, those were kind of the people who were churning out interesting grape seedlings back then. So I probably spent 10 or 11 years just growing a lot of things. that were potential parents from both from Peter and from Elmer Swenson and Dave McGregor and some other ones as well, a few New York ones. I probably grew 150 or so different grapes, and I made wine out of all of them too, because I decided, I'm breeding wine grapes here, and I'm not going to use something as a parent unless I've either tasted a decent wine that someone else has made, or I made a decent wine out of it myself. So I vetted everything that way, and I guess in retrospect, I'm really glad I did, because one of my goals was to get rid of the acidity problem, and I managed to do that. I was hoping to get a little more tannin in the reds, and that's at least the case for Verona and Petit Pearl. So aside from the wine quality characteristics that I was seeking, I was really just trying to get something that was hardier than what we had, hardier than St. Croix. And at the time we didn't have Frontenac and we didn't have Marquette. I was curious when Frontenac was introduced, and I was kind of shocked that it was introduced as late as 1996.
Really?
Yeah, and that's the year I did my Petit Pearl cross, 1996. Yeah, so that hasn't been around all that long. So there was a huge void in commercial cold hardy grape varieties during that time. Everyone was hard at work developing things, but the process is so slow that Frontenac came out in 1996, and Marquette in 2006.
Okay, so I'm so surprised to hear this, because so I've been to the Hort Farm in Chanhassen and saw the mother plant of Frontenac, and the original planting is like the 60s, right? Like it's 60 years old, but they probably didn't commercialize it then till the 90s.
Yeah, it's had kind of they didn't commercialize it until the 90s. So the history is, I don't know if you've run into Pat Piarchi anywhere. He's the winemaker at Ohio State, the lab winemaker at Ohio State. Well, he was a grad student at the Hort Research Center back in the 70s when Cecil Stushnoff ran the shop there. And that's when Elmer worked there too. Elmer worked there as a technician for 10 years. So those are three pretty smart people thinking about grapes. So Patrick and Cecil went on these canoe trips on the Minnesota River to find really good-looking wild Riparia grapes, and the best one they found on the Minnesota River was Riparia 89, which is the Riparia parent of Frontenac. And then they also went up to Manitoba, like way northwest of Winnipeg, and they found the very northern range of where Riparias grow, and they collected a bunch of Riparias up there too, which they brought back. And I think one of those is in both Marquette and Petit Pearl. I'm sure it's in Minnesota 1094. So they collected all these Riparias, and then they crossed them with French hybrids. That's where Frontenac. So Frontenac is from that Minnesota River Riparia crossed with Lando 244, and so Patrick got his master's degree and left the grape world for a long time, doing something else. And those seedlings, they had hundreds and hundreds of these Riparia seedlings that Patrick left behind, just sat there, and because they didn't have anyone who had any time to do anything with them until 1985 when Peter came, and that was his first project, was to sort through all that stuff and make some selections. And Frontenac Minnesota 1047 was the best selection out of there. But then they hadn't made any wine or anything, so that all takes time, and to propagate them up, so you have some sort of mother block, and all that ended up taking 11 years. And even though the vines had been, the seedlings were there for a long time.
Okay, so the seedling of Frontenac came about sometime in the 70s, but then was planted in a block outside in the 80s and then commercialized in the 90s.
Yep.
Got it.
Yep.
Wow.
Long
Okay, so I think that that's something that a lot of people a lot of our customers don't realize, that our grape varieties are so new, and I didn't even realize, like I've still been saying back down to the 60s at least, but so it's just so crazy to think that all of these grape varieties have really only come about and been available to growers and winemakers in the Midwest for the last 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. So Patrick is this, it's just so incredibly humble. He kind of doesn't like people giving him any credit for anything, but he's the one who found the wild riparias that are genetically are the cold hardy source in all our hybrids. And also bred Frontenac while he was there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned, sorry, Randall, go
No,
ahead.
go ahead. Ladies
Okay, so
first, Ian.
All right, you mentioned before that a couple of the goals that you were looking for were to fix the acid problem. Can you describe what you mean by that? Yeah.
I guess my goal was to develop some varieties that had acidity more like vinifera,
Okay.
and in red wine especially.
So a lower acidity than what we're
Lower
used to.
acidity, yeah, that was more in balance with the other characteristics of the grape, flavor characteristics of the grape. And I think maybe balance in general balance in the wine was something I was really, really looking for. Yeah. And flavor wise, I don't like Nebraska flavors in red wine any more than anyone else does, but I really don't like Riparia flavors in red wine either. So I was pretty careful what I used for quality parents. So I didn't introduce any of that.
So Nebraska flavors, you're talking about the foxiness, the kind of grapiness that we talk about, right?
Yeah, that Concord, yeah.
Concord grapiness. Okay, so what would Riparia flavors typically be?
To me, it's kind of a herbaceous, kind of a green kind of flavor. Yeah.
Okay.
So when you're breeding your grapes, Tom, I assume you don't make wine out of every selection, right? You probably wait till it's a little more promising, but when you're going through your selections and tasting them, do you get a sense that it could be a good wine grape, or does it really, you have to make wine out of it to really know for sure?
It's easier to do that with whites than reds for me.
Okay.
I mean, there are whites that I'll just taste one ripe berry and I'll think, holy cow, this has incredible flavor and soft acidity, and it's going to make really good wine. And with reds, I think, I'm not very good at tasting tannin in the skins. I know some people who are, but I'm not very good at that. So with reds, I'm more inclined to, feel like I have to make the wine and see what comes out of the skins, for that reason. Yeah. But yeah, I kind of learned to taste Riparia and Nebraska flavors just in the berries, and I'm pretty good at tasting the acidity. But yeah, with the whites, it's easier to do. For some reason, the flavors seem to be more clear and more clean, good or bad. They're easier to detect.
Yeah. Okay, so when you have a couple of parents that you're thinking might be a good cross, and you make the cross, you pollinate some flowers on one from pollen on the other.
Mhm.
And then what's the process? How long does this take? What's the process here?
Oh, okay. Well, you bag it after you put the pollinate the flowers. You bag it. You put a bag on so you don't get any insect pollination or any wind pollen blowing in there. And then you just let it hang until the grapes are ripe. And
Okay.
the last things I harvest are the bag clusters because I like them to get super ripe to make sure the seed is really matured. And then you extract the seed and clean it up and just store it dry until you're ready to put it in cold storage. The grape seeds need about 90 days of cold moist stratification, they call it, cold moist treatment in as close to freezing as you can get it. And you take the seeds out, and it's usually the first week in March for me, and plant them out in seed flats, and when they're a couple inches tall, transplant them into pots and grow them out until they're ready to plant out, in vineyard rows. And usually that's right away that first spring, they grow enough that you can do that. There are always some that have less vigor and you have to hold them over in a nursery row, for a year and plant them the second year. This year, because of the drought, they all went in a nursery row because I don't have irrigation. And we were in the extreme drought region of Minnesota. And even then, it was the middle of June, and the forecast, it had been really dry for a month, and the forecast was really dire for the rest of the summer. And I thought, well, this is crazy to plant these out in the vineyard. So I put them in the nursery row where I have trickle irrigation, and they did great. They had, while everything else suffered, they were doing fine.
Okay.
Then you plant those out, and I plant them really close together, probably 20 to 24 inches apart, because after 5 years, 3/4 of them are going to be gone anyway for various reasons. And you kind of end up with halfway decent spacing between the ones that are left. So I usually start making selections right away. Sometimes I don't have too much problems with mildew, but I had one horrible cross that I did that I crossed La Crescent with this really lovely Muscat grape from Dave McGregor up there in St. Cloud, thinking, wow, some of these are going to produce incredible wine. And so I had them all in nursery rows that summer. There were probably 200 of them. And middle of July, like every one of them was plastered with downy mildew. And I thought, this experiment is over. I pulled them all out. And it would be really silly to try to move on any of these into the vineyard and try to go further with them. So that was really disappointing. But so sometimes it's as easy as that. Sometimes seedlings here and there will be susceptible to mildew, and I usually get rid of those unless they have some other really good trait. You get a fair number of males, which don't produce any fruit. They're useless, so I pull those out.
I won't laugh too hard at that one.
Rogue out the males. My wife likes that one too. Yeah, get rid of the males out of there.
So how many years do you get your first fruit off of those generally?
4 to 5 years. They take about a year longer than something you root from a hardwood cutting, just because they start out so small, and their root system is really small to start with. Once that happens, once they have their first crop, maybe it's usually just a few clusters. At least you can taste them and you can see what the cluster size is, and you get the whole range of cluster sizes. And sometimes you just look at it and say, well, this is so small, it's just not commercially viable. Like anything under 60 grams, I would just get rid of. unless
So
again,
what would
you've
that
got,
look like? About a fist or so? A
oh,
little
it's
less than a fist?
really tiny. It's kind of
Really
like,
tiny.
it's kind of like, yeah, if you, it's maybe like an inch and a half in diameter or something like
Yeah.
that. It's really small,
Yeah.
or a little bigger than that.
Mhm.
There's so many vineyards that still hand pick grapes.
Yeah.
I'm thinking no one's going to want to pick these. So,
Mhm.
uh, and I don't know, you just imagine if you wanted to get, like 6 or 7 tons an acre. I don't know how many buds you'd have to leave on those, but it'd be a lot. So I get rid of those too. Um, and there's kind of this debate about whether you cull out the female vines as well, because you always get, depending on your parents, you always get females. Some breeders, like Bruce Reich out of Cornell, keeps only the hermaphrodites because they're self-pollinating. And there's kind of this discussion about whether a female variety, even if it's really good, is really marketable. And I mean, St. Pepin is female. That's kind of the one strong case I can think of that says, well, you should really keep the females too, at least for a while. But St. Pepin needs lacrosse to be a pollinator to it. And, you really have to be prepared to sell a pretty good pollinator variety too at the same time. So I don't know. That all complicates it. I keep the females because unless they have some other flaw, I keep those too. And often I end up using them as breeding parents. Yeah. So that at year 5, you usually by year 5, you can get maybe a couple pounds of grapes, and that's enough to make a bottle of wine or a half bottle of wine, something like that. And it's enough to it's enough to at least to taste and see what happens when it's fermented. And this year I made about 60 of those, and in probably in my busiest years I made maybe 120, which is over the top too many to manage. Because they have to manage them just like big fermentations. They don't all ripen at the same time. So you have fermentations that have been going. It started at different times over 6 or 7 weeks period of time, and so they're at all different stages of finishing and needing attention. But I think that's a really important thing to do. I do it as soon as I can. Usually, if it's something that looks like everything else is good in a vineyard and looks like it might be promising for wine, it's really worth the effort to do that. And then I get a group of people together and we taste those blind, and I get really good feedback. That is not biased by my knowledge of the cross and those folks.
Is that ever hard for you, Tom? Like you've put all this time and effort into them. Is it hard to let some of them go, that don't make the cut?
It really is. And I'm inclined to keep them around anyway. But my wife, thank goodness, is trying to make me pay attention to that more, because she thinks I need to start like winding down the amount of work this is. And she's right, I do. So yeah, she's always on me to pull out things that I'm not using anymore or that aren't going anywhere. Yeah, it is hard to do. Unless they're really bad. Those are easy to pull.
Yeah. So what in your mind, if you could, I don't know, in a few sentences, what is your ideal wine grape? What do you think about an ideal wine grape? Because I'm just curious if we're all kind of on the same page or not on that.
Both in the vineyard and for wine, or
Yeah, both. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, in the vineyard, I mean, really consistent cold hardiness in midwinter. Cold hardiness is still important. We had that polar vortex in 2019. It got 38 below zero in Hugo, where I am. And then 2 years ago, we had 32 below zero the 15th of February.
Mhm.
Those are just really extreme things. And that's, I mean, that's only like 3 years apart that happened. So I think we're still in for some of those, even though, mostly we're going to get milder winters like this. So I'm still really paying attention to that. And I do have a couple of selections that produced really well after that 2019 polar vortex, and the wine is pretty good on them. And I'm thinking, those really have some value besides just being breeding parents. One of those might actually get introduced eventually too. So that's still a big thing. I think what's getting more important is how they withstand nasty cold snaps during the transition seasons. Like early November, and then February, March, when they maybe had some warm days and they're starting to deacclimate. And not like right now, I'm just holding my breath that we don't get any below zero temperatures now, because it's 54 degrees here today.
Yeah.
And also, we've had, spring has always been kind of dicey here. We can get warm temperatures in March and they deacclimate, and then it gets cold again in early April. And we seem to be getting these late frosts in May. So I think late bud break, continues to be a really good trait. What else?
Can I just stop you on that real quick? I have to say that the more and more I talk to other growers from around the country, they're in comparing grapes that they want to plant, they're always gravitating towards your late bud break varieties, just
really?
because of the huge issue with the frost, the late freezes, the late frosts,
Yeah.
and not even just in the upper Midwest, but also I'm seeing people in Missouri who are doing that, in Southern Illinois, Georgia, who are looking for varieties that can handle, that are still they're still acclimated to the winter all the way through early May, and then don't come out till after that.
Yeah. I think you're right. Those late frosts in May are just part of this erratic weather that we're seeing, and probably going to continue to see. And I know here I actually kind of plotted those frosts in May, plotted those out one time, and and we're getting them like every 3 years we seem to get one. And they can be as late as Mother's Day. It is really, really bizarre. But the other thing I've been working on, last summer we had a record drought, but we probably got 6 inches of rain in September. When it finally started raining, it had a rain in the middle of September to mess things up. So one of the things I've been working on for quite a few years is introducing a trait for having thick skins on the berries, and I have quite a few selections that I'm evaluating that have these tough skins, and it's amazing. They can get a foot of rain in September and they don't split. They don't get bunch rot, and yellow jackets can't puncture them, which is also all the things I think about that can really mess up grapes, really nice grapes, just before they're fully ripe. It's like yellow jackets and Asian lady beetles. And Asian lady beetles don't even bother these. And yellow jackets try to sting through the skin, but all they leave is a little dent. They can't puncture the skin on these.
I think you got to catch some video of that, Tom. I'd be entertained to watch that. So
I did. I watched them. I've stood there and watched them try to work their way into one of these berries, and they finally get frustrated and leave. They can't when they can't do it. And the other good thing is along with the thick skin comes some pretty heavy duty tannin in the wine.
Okay.
So anyway, I'm on my third generation of breeding those, and eventually I'll have something out, at least for reds. I'll have something like that out. So all those traits combined, and I think one more trait is probably a good growth habit, and a vine that's easy to manage without a whole lot of trimming and manipulation in the summer. I know people like that about Petit Pearl.
Yeah.
It just kind of naturally grows out in droops and on a high wire, and the fruit's right there, and it's not real vigorous. Yeah, so that's kind of the ideal grape, I guess, in the field to me, and those are all things that I pay a lot of attention to. Yeah.
I think some people in the wine industry always look at it from, well, if it makes good wine, we should grow it. And I kind of don't agree with that. Again, I'm more the grower anyway, so Murley Dermaticari was kind of one of my mentors, and one thing he always said to me is if we can't get an economical yield out of it, who cares? Who cares if it makes good wine? If we can't pull 4 tons off of it, why are we even messing with it? Because it just increases the price of the wine. And his argument was, if we can't successfully grow it in the vineyard, it doesn't matter if we can make good wine out of it, because the growers are just going to lose money, get frustrated, and then there won't be an industry. And so, like Ann was saying, that late bud break is so important. And I think as you get farther south, it becomes even more important. I think as we look at some of these kind of cold hardy varieties increasing their footprint, we like Marquette and so forth, but the early bud break, even these areas that are zone 7 or 8 or 6 that are growing it, the early bud break is still an issue for them. And so I always look at cold hardiness in 2 ways. Yeah, it can live through the winter, but that's no good either if it gets zapped by a late frost every year. And so I do think the late bud break is definitely a trait that growers are looking for and appreciate, in like Petit Pearl and so forth, that not only is it cold hardy, it also deacclimates slowly. So late bud break is less of a concern, early bud break, excuse me, is less of a concern.
Yeah. Well, from the wine side, I guess the characteristics of the grape from the wine side, I kind of talked about that a little, but I think I I don't consciously when I do crosses, I don't consciously expect that I'm gonna get something that is exactly like some vinifera variety for wine. It's nice if that happens sometimes, but it really rarely happens, because there's such a jumble of species in those grapes. So I just kind of look at this. I kind of consider a success if I end up with a grape that makes wine that has good balance and good basic structure, and is interesting, has some interesting aroma and complexity, and that's pleasant, and some nice flavor and finish that is consistent throughout. Just kind of basic structural tasting sorts of things. And if it happens to remind people of Chardonnay or something, that's great. But it's really hard to set out and say that's what you're going to do, and you'll probably never get there. You'll probably pass up a lot of really good grapes and not get there. So that's kind of what I look for on the wine side.
So you've released so far 3 grape varieties.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right.
And there's the 4th one that is really old. It's been introduced this year in Canada through a nursery I work with in Canada that brought it in from the Foundation Plant Service in California years ago. And then Inland Desert Nursery and Northeastern Vine Supply is going to be selling it too. Inland Desert is actually, they kind of jumped on it really quick at the right time, and they're actually selling vines this year. I think Andy is probably going to take another year or two, but that one, it's actually a sister to Verona, but looks totally different and makes this totally different wine style. The wine is kind of Bordeaux like, lots of tannin and lots of structure in the middle mouth. So it's really good for blending, where that with other varieties where that might be missing. It doesn't take much. It takes maybe, if I wanted to blend it with, well, I don't know, with a crimson pearl or something like that, a lighter wine that's a little bit lighter. It maybe takes 10 or 15% is all you'd need to really, really fill out the mouthfeel in it. But it's good as a varietal too, and it ages. Bear Creek Winery up in Fargo has been working with it for a really long time, probably 10 years. He always gets the grapes from me in the fall. And so we have some that have been bottle aged for 5 or 6 years, and we pop one of those open once in a while, and it just really improves with age. So we're gonna, if I get the name approved, it's going to be named Veritage.
Ooh.
Which is a fake French name that sounds like it's a Bordeaux name or something. And I was reluctant to make up a French name until my friends in Quebec convinced me it at least has to sound like a French name. And they said Meritage is just made up anyway. The Meritage, Pinotage is all made up too, just to sound. Those are not real French words. And I thought, okay, so they came up with this idea, this Veritage idea.
So your releases have all been red so far. Was that on purpose, or is that just how it happened?
Oh no, it's very much on purpose, because I have this other career. I decided I needed to just, if I was going to do this, I had to just focus on one thing at a time. So I focused on red wines because I thought we had fewer options for dry red wines. Then we had, a lot of whites came out of Elmer's program and U of M, but not as many reds. So that's why I focused on reds. It was just pragmatic. Once I retired from Honeywell in 2012, then I really started having time to work on whites. So I have a lot of white seedlings, and this year I made 8 selections and made wine from those, and we did an evaluation, and there's some really, really good wine grapes in there, but they're only like 6 years old, so they haven't been through a lot in the vineyard, and we've only had this one wine from them. So
we have about 10 years left to wait on those then, huh?
Oh, I hope no. I can't wait 10 years. I just turned 73, so I can't wait 10 years. I don't want to be doing this when I'm 80. I have to really pick up the pace here and move something out here in maybe 5 years. And I've kind of learned how to do that. There are a bunch of things. A bunch of things you have to do once you've decided you're going to commercialize something. You have to get the patent. I usually pay to have them virus tested at UC Davis and get those in the repository, get it in the repository. So you can export it, you can send it to Canada, or you can sell in Washington, Oregon, California, those states that are really strict. You just have to get a mother block going at a nursery or two, a fairly big one. And starting out with one seedling, there isn't that much wood to go around. Get some secondary test plots going. But I sort of figured out that you can do most of those things in parallel instead of trying to do it one thing at a time. You definitely can do the virus testing and the patent application at the same time, start growing up the mother blocks, and it just takes kind of a lot of coordination. But so I think I'm learning how to do this faster, and hopefully I will be able to get a white out within 5 years or so.
I'm so excited.
So we had a ton of great info from Tom. So we're actually going to break up our discussion with Tom into 2 different episodes. So tune into the second part of this in the near future. Thanks for listening. Check out Unwrapping Wine Podcast on Facebook and Instagram for information about the show, upcoming episodes, and to provide feedback.